joke.
Okay.
There's this guy, and he was stranded in the desert. He was in the desert for days and days and days. And then he sees a house, so he goes to the house. And he's like, I've been in the desert for days and days and days, so he let me in. It was a house of monks. By the way, weird fact, they have monk college in North Carolina. I thought that was so cool. They have a billboard.
Like to learn how to be a monk? Kind of.
It says got monks, but anyway.
That's awesome.
It is. But this guy, anyway, and then he goes to sleep that night, and he hears this sound. He's like, what's that sound? So he gets up, and he's like, monk, what was that noise? He's like, I can't tell you, you're not a monk. He's like, okay, so he goes to sleep, hears it again, he gets up, and he's like, monk, what's that noise? He goes, I can't tell you, you're not a monk. So he decides he's going to be a monk. So the monk was like, oh no, sorry. He was like, okay. And he gave him a key, and he opened the door, and there's a big desert. So he sprints across the desert. He gets to the other side, and there's a door, but he doesn't have the key. So he sprints back across the desert, and he gets another key, and he sprints back across the desert, and he opens the door, and he's in a forest. He goes into the forest, but a tree falls down, so he goes around the tree. It takes one day, and he goes in the forest, gets to the other side, but he doesn't have the key. So he goes back to the forest and around the tree, and it takes one day. And he sprints across the desert, and he gets another key. Yes, you told the joke. And no. And he sprints back across the desert into the forest and around the tree, and it takes one day. And he goes into the jungle, and he's walking through the jungle, and he comes to a river, and he doesn't have a raft. So he builds a raft, and it takes 3 days, and he gets to the other side, but he doesn't have a key.
How many days did this take? That's a question.
No. And then he goes back to the jungle, but an animal had destroyed his raft, so he has to rebuild it, and it takes 3 days. And then he goes across the river, into the forest, and around the tree, and it takes one day, and he sprints across the desert, and he gets another key. So he sprints back across the desert, into the forest, and around the tree, and it takes one day, and he goes into the jungle, but an animal had destroyed his raft. So he has to rebuild it, and it takes 3 days, and he goes through the rest of the jungle, and he opens the door, mountainous area, and he goes over 1 mountain, 2 mountains, 3 mountains, he gets to the other side, but he doesn't have a key, so he goes over 1 mountain, 2 mountains, 3 mountains, into the jungle, but sorry, but an animal had destroyed its raft, so he has to rebuild it. It takes 3 days, and he goes across the river, and he goes into the forest, around the tree.
I think we should put the beginning of this, the end of this, and then the middle. Which one is on YouTube?
And around the tree, and it takes 1 day. My voice keeps cracking. I don't know why. Anyway, and he goes across the desert, and he gets another key, so he sprints back across the desert into the forest, around the tree, and it takes 1 day. And he goes into the jungle, but
slightly.
I know.
Keep going.
And I hate my smile.
I think it's adorable.
He goes into the jungle, but an animal had destroyed his raft. So he has to rebuild it, and it takes 3 days. And then he goes across the river, and he goes 1 mountain, 2 mountains, 3 mountains. He opens the door, and there's a really big build.
The raft with him.
We don't know. And he opens the door, and there's a big build. He clogs across the build, and he gets to the other side, but he doesn't see it. So he clogs back across the build, and he goes into the jungle. No. He goes over 1 mountain, 2 mountains, 3 mountains into the jungle. And an animal had destroyed his raft, so he has to rebuild it, and it takes 3 days, and he goes into the forest around the tree, and it takes 1 day. And he sprints across the desert, and he gets another key. And he sprints back across the desert into the forest around the tree.
How many times have you told this joke before?
Oh, so many.
Okay.
And it takes 1 day, and then he goes into the jungle, but an animal.
How many minutes of your life that is?
A lot.
It's like a 12-minute video.
And an animal had destroyed its raft, so he has to rebuild it, and it takes 3 days, and then he goes across the river into the over 1 mountain, 2 mountains, 3 mountains, and frogs across the field, and then he opens the door, and he's at a beach, and he goes across the beach, and there's a really big chest, but he doesn't have a key. So he goes back across the beach, and he goes across the field, and over 1 mountain, 2 mountains, 3 mountains into the jungle, but an animal had destroyed his raft. So he has to rebuild it, and it takes 3 days, and he goes into the forest around the tree, and it takes 1 day, and he sprints across the desert, and he gets another key, but this time, it is really big key. So he drags it across the desert. It doesn't fit the chest. And he drags it, no that's not it, into the forest.
Try to keep it.
And around the tree, but it takes 2 days.
How many days does it take to build a raft?
And he goes into the jungle, and an animal had destroyed his raft. So he has to rebuild his raft. It takes 3 days. He goes across the river, and he drives it over 1 mountain, 2 mountains, 3 mountains. And he drags it across the field, and he drags it across the beach, and he puts it in the the chest to find out the sound. Would you like to know the sound?
Yes.
But I can't tell